Well, Kim, thanks for meeting with me today. I wanted to just do a brief recording to help those people that use the Johns Hopkins evidence-based practice tools to know what's new and just help them become familiar with the new tools a little bit easier.
Sure. Just to give our listeners a little bit of background, we have just finished the 4th revision of our evidence-based practice modeling guidelines book. And each time we revise the book, we go back to feedback that we've received from users all over the world, really, to make the tools and the appendices a lot more user-friendly. So the changes that we're going to go through in these recordings is really based on feedback from users, based on our own feedback and kind of how we've grown to use these tools over time. So the first tool, Appendix A, that's the PET Process Guide. Used to be called the PET Management Guide. We're calling it the PET Process Guide. The biggest change you'll see right off the bat is that we've gotten rid of that first page entirely. The work plan is basically the same as the old tool. We have changed the wording on some of the steps. We've added one additional step, and we've simplified it a little bit. Instead of talking about start date, end date, person assigned, we've really just made it more of a Gantt chart. So you look at the month, and you can shade in what month you're going to take or how long you're going to take to accomplish each of those steps.
I like that. It's much more user-friendly. I also noticed that on the various steps of the process, the specific appendix is noted to really help those people that are walking through the process know which tool they should be using at that step that they're in.
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to add that kind of helpful hint there just so that you know, okay, we're on step 12. We need to be on Appendix H.
Good, good. I love the flowchart in the PET Process Guide on the second page. Can you tell us a little bit more about the decision tree and why it was included?
Yeah, so the decision tree ties into the new step that I said that we added. So under the practice question section, we added a step to determine the need for an EBP project. So it's now step number 6, determine the need for an EBP project. We found that a lot of times in our experience, people were conducting EBP projects that really maybe didn't need to be conducted for one reason or another. Maybe the hospital didn't support it. Maybe it's already been determined what best practices are. Maybe there's not a lot of information out there. So we wanted to give people this decision tree so that they made a conscious effort to think about the EBP project and really assess whether or not it was necessary before they took that deep dive into doing the whole project. And I think this is fairly straightforward. You just start at the start and move through and answer the questions, and it flows from there.
That makes a lot of sense.
One thing that I do want to point out that we will see in most of the appendices is that we refer you back to the chapter in the book where you can see completed versions of these tools. So you can see on the directions page for Appendix A, it's the See Chapter 11, Lessons from Practice, that will give you an example of what this should look like when it's filled out.
Great. I like that. Okay, I think we wrapped up Appendix A. Let's move on to the next one. All right, let's move on to Appendix B then. So what can you tell me is difference between the previous version and the new version of the question development tool?
Appendix B did not undergo a lot of major changes. There are a couple wording changes here and there, and we've changed the order of things. The biggest thing that I would like to point out is how we're dealing with search terms. In the previous tools, we just asked you to list possible search terms, databases, and your search strategies. With the revised tool, we're actually asking you to use your PICO elements to pull out your search terms. This is how we've taught this since we began the EBP model, but we never really had that reflected in the tool. So that's what's new here. We're also asking you to identify inclusion and exclusion criteria. What are you going to include or not include during your search? You'll also notice that we've really simplified the outcome measurements. Our initial thought was to bring the outcome measurement plan early on in the process so that people were thinking about it. But I think with the new tool, it's a little bit more simplified. We're still asking you to think about what you're going to measure. How are you going to know that your project is successful? And we'll get deeper into that measurement plan as we go farther along in the process.
That's great. I love the PICO element and search terms. I think that's a great strategy to use during their literature searches. It's going to really help them find that evidence.
Yeah, I hope so.
So let's move on then to Appendix C. Appendix C, the previous version was just called the Stakeholder Analysis Tool. Now it looks very similar to the new version, but can you tell me what's different about it?
So Appendix C, once the Stakeholder Analysis Tool, is now called the Stakeholder Analysis and Communication Tool. So the first part of the appendix is looking at the stakeholder analysis. And you can see on the first page that the stakeholder analysis roles and responsibilities is now a stakeholder analysis matrix. We're still talking about the roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders, but we're also getting more in depth. What is their impact? What matters most to them? How can they contribute or how can they hinder this project? And then identifying strategies to help engage the stakeholder.
Oh, that's great. I can see how that would be very helpful.
So the next part of this process is the communication planning. And if you can remember, in our previous tools, we had a specific dissemination appendix. We still have that, but the communication part of that dissemination, we've moved into the stakeholder analysis tool because it marries well with your stakeholders. What are the messages that you need to give those stakeholders, either at the beginning of the process, throughout the process, or when you're finished? So the communication tool helps you identify who are those people that I need to inform about the project. What is the key message that I'm sending? And how am I going to deliver that message? So that's the biggest difference with this tool.
It really makes sense, since obviously in dissemination you're talking about how we're going to deliver the message or how we're going to tell people about what we've done. So this appendix is pretty much all things communication.
Communication is such a big part of our stakeholders, engaging our stakeholders, that we felt like it needed to be a part of this tool.
Absolutely, I agree. Okay, well that wraps up Appendix C. Okay, so let's look at Appendix D, the Hierarchy of Evidence Guide. Now this looks dramatically different than the previous version. So why the changes, Kim?
So Appendix D was once called the Evidence Level and Quality Guide. And we've now just named it the Hierarchy of Evidence Guide. We had a lot of difficulty just trying to keep everything straight on the original form, identifying the levels and then looking at the quality ratings. And we were finding that a lot of people were just kind of guessing at the quality ratings. They would just use this form, determine that they had level 2 evidence, and then say, I think it's B quality. And we really wanted to make sure that people were using the appraisal forms, Appendix E and Appendix F, to determine the quality. To streamline things, to make it a bit easier and make this form a lot cleaner, we're simply giving you the level of evidence and some examples of studies or pieces of evidence that you would find under that level. So we're still referring people back to the evidence appraisal tools, Appendix E and Appendix F, but this is still kind of a good quick reference. Let's say you picked up a study and it says that it's a qualitative study. You can quickly look at this and say, oh, qualitative study, that's level 3.
This tool is very handy, especially if you're new to EBP and still learning about the different levels, just to keep it on hand and use it as a quick reference. This is the one we get laminated because we use it so much.
Absolutely.
Okay, so next let's talk about Appendix E. And I'm a little bit nervous because this is a pretty thick one. It's pretty in-depth. But how did the new version of Appendix E, the Research Evidence Appraisal tool, get better?
Appendix E and Appendix F are always the most intimidating forms out of the lot, I think. And again, based on feedback from users over the years, we've tried to really streamline Appendix E and make it a lot more intuitive, so that hopefully people aren't flipping around from page 2 to page 6, and we're trying to keep everything that goes together so that it just kind of flows page after page. On the first page of Appendix E, there's not a whole lot of difference. We just changed around where things were. One thing I do want to point out is that study findings that help answer the EBP question are now front and center on the first page. They used to be under each section, and whatever section you were in, that's where you would put your study findings, but it seemed to make much more sense to us to just put them on the front page. The next change that I want to point out is if we look at section 1, where we're looking at quantitative appraisal, previously we were just looking at answering questions, yes/no questions. We've converted those yes/no questions into a decision tree or a flow diagram. Was there a manipulation of an independent variable, yes or no?
Oh, and then you go through and answer questions in that format.
Yeah, absolutely. That will give you whether you have level 1, level 2, or level 3 evidence.
Very nice. I like that.
Yeah, it seemed a little bit easier than what we had previously was, if yes to questions 1 and 2 and no to question 3. And so this just seems a little bit more straightforward. And then some of the wording for the appraisal questions might have changed, but the general context is the same. We haven't added anything really substantial to that.
These sound like some great improvements. Is there anything else about E you'd like to mention?
Well, we also, just to point out, we're keeping the quality rating together. So we wanted to have the quantitative appraisal and the quality rating all in one section so that you're not flipping around trying to find it. Same flow chart we added to the summary of multiple sources of evidence. Just as you walked through that decision tree for a single piece of research evidence, you can do the same for multiple sources of evidence.
Okay, I can see that right on page 4. Okay, well, those changes weren't too bad. They made a lot of sense. So let's move on now to the next one, Appendix F. All right, Kim, as we move on to Appendix F, I mean, the first thing that I see is that there is a whole article appraisal workflow on the front page. That is obviously a change from the previous one.
Yeah, we wanted to make it a bit easier for users to be able to find the section that they needed. In previous versions of Appendix F, users would have to flip through the pages to find that particular section. So if they were looking for a case report, they'd just have to keep flipping it until they found a case report. So with this workflow, we ask them to identify what kind of evidence do you have, and then we say what level it is, and then what section they need to go to in order to complete the appraisal.
Much more streamlined. I like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, great. So moving right along to Appendix G, the individual evidence summary tool. It looks pretty similar to the last version.
Yeah, it is very similar. The only changes that I think I could point out are we added a column for the reviewers' names. If you remember your EBP process, we always encourage teams to have more than one person review each article. So you want to make note of who read what article so that if you had questions, you knew who to go back to. We also added a column for intervention. What was it that they did that we wanted to make note of? And then there's a notes to team column.
So maybe if you read something in the article that you really want to share with your team, but maybe doesn't fall into any of the categories, you would use this space to keep note of it?
Yeah, absolutely. You could add the note right there. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same as our previous editions.
Again, I love these improvements. I think it's just going to make these tools even easier to use. So let's move on to the next. So when we get to the synthesis and recommendations tool, Appendix H, what changes have been made?
In the old versions, we had some key points as the first page of the tool. We have moved those key points into the directions and tried to incorporate them more in the tool itself. So if we skip past that, the actual table itself is pretty much the same. We're looking at the strength, quality rating, total number of sources, and the synthesized findings. It's really when we move past the table itself that we see a little bit more of the changes that we've put into place. So we're asking on the newest tool, where does the evidence show consistency? Where does it show inconsistency? We've left a space for the best evidence recommendations. So once you've identified what the evidence is telling you, where there's consistency and where there's inconsistency, what are the best evidence recommendations that you can come up with? And then similar to the old version, we're asking about strong and compelling, good evidence, or little or no evidence.
This is great. I think these additions are really going to help people synthesize their evidence a lot easier. It's going to walk them through it even more.
I agree.
Appendix I, the translation and action planning tool. This looks like it got a complete makeover.
It did. It really did. I think through discussions with our team and our editors, we really felt like translation was one of those places where people needed a little bit more help, and we needed to provide a little bit more direction than we had in the past. So again, we're looking at the strong and compelling, little or no evidence, and then we're talking about the level of safety risk. And this is something new that we're introducing, not necessarily saying that we hadn't thought about this before, but it's never been really a part of our appendix. So we're asking teams to identify what kind of risk is associated with this intervention. Obviously, things that are higher risk, you're going to want to make sure you have much stronger evidence. You're going to have a lot more evidence and make sure that it's strong and compelling. The second thing is the addition of this decision tree, the translation assessment flowchart. So just looking at what kind of evidence do I have and how does that direct my course of action. If I have strong, compelling evidence and consistent results, change is indicated. So it's the same thing that we had on our old tools, just in a different format. Easier to read format, I think.
It sure is. I think people are really going to find this helpful.
And then you're going to walk through, based on the translation assessment, what's your course of action? Here's where we're going to talk about fit and feasibility and acceptability. Previously, that was on Appendix H. We've moved it here to Appendix I. And then organization-specific recommendations. So not to be confused with the best evidence recommendations that we identified on Appendix H. These are the things that are specific to our hospital or our organization that we want to implement. And then Section 2 asks, when a change or pilot is not indicated, what are the next steps? So there are some times when we're completing EBP projects that it really isn't feasible to make the change, but we still want to identify what the next steps are going to be. We don't want things to just die off right there. And then action planning is similar to the action planning that we had on the previous tools. We're still identifying strengths, barriers, what's our plan to overcome those barriers, and then the outcome measurement plan is here as well.
So same concepts, just a different appearance.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully a little bit easier.
It makes it a lot easier walking through the entire process, especially with the flowcharts. I really like those additions. So Appendix J. Now, I remember you saying that the dissemination portion of Appendix J was now added to Appendix C because that's where the stakeholders and the key messages were involved. So what takes the place of Appendix J?
Appendix J, once the dissemination tool, is now our publication guide. As you mentioned, most of the internal dissemination, the communication within our organization, we moved to Appendix C as a part of the stakeholder analysis and communication tool. So Appendix J, still about dissemination, but we're really talking about external dissemination, about publication. We wanted to provide EBP teams a template for publishing their evidence-based practice project. So this publication guide gives you prompts and tells you what appendix you can use to answer those prompts. So for example, in the introduction, you're going to look at Appendix B, and you can answer a lot of these questions just based off the information that you included in Appendix B.
So when you're writing an article, you can follow this as an outline, for example, the title, the abstract, your introduction, and your methods. It pretty much provides an outline for a journal publication.
Yeah, absolutely. You can use this for a journal publication, but you can also use this as a template for your poster presentations as well. You know, it's the same content, and it just helps you to identify that content a little bit easier.
Well, these are great. I love all the additions, and it definitely does make it more streamlined and easier. And for those people that are visual with the flowcharts, it makes the whole process just seem much smoother. So I think these are great changes. I hope they're well received. And I like the fact that it's based off of the feedback of our users. So we've heard your input, we've heard your feedback, and we incorporated that feedback into this new version of the tools.
Absolutely. And if anybody has any questions, any comments, feel free to email us. We're always open to suggestions.
Well, thanks, Kim. Thanks for meeting with me today. And good luck, everyone out there, and good luck with your EBP projects.
Yes, good luck.